We were truly blessed to have the Congressman with us to really encourage us, motivate us, appreciate us. And I think the message he left us with, bring the messages back to the various races. Those of you who can, take him up on that. Those of you who come from different parts of the world, let's take him up on that in our countries. Because if we don't find a way to elevate this, we are going to keep treading water. However, we have with us a wonderful keynote speaker, and we are very much looking forward to his remarks. This is Rob Johansson, Chief Economist at the U.S. Department for Agriculture. Rob, welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Rahul, for inviting me, and for my colleagues at FAO and IFPRI also for asking me to come and speak today. I think I'm the one speaker out of the 7 that comes at this issue from the production side. We'll hear obviously a lot of talk about that we just saw from Maximo and the speakers that are following on the consumption side. But I do want to say that this issue is near and dear to my heart. Although I don't have as much time to work on it these days at USDA. I just wanted to note my first job with the U.S. government was as an extension agent in rural Zaire, now a Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that we see continues to suffer from significant food insecurity from the report. Again, I won't retread a lot of information that's already been talked about, but just wanted to point out for the SDG number 2 goal, as pointed out by Maximo just now, there's a downward trend, and of course this doesn't even pick up the most recent information from this year's SOFI. And of course since 2015 we've seen significant downturns, highlighting the importance of economic slowdowns in some of these regions, particularly in Africa. Obviously many of these factors contribute to food insecurity, and they're linked, whether that be conflict, slowing global demand for commodities, and that will all show up in metrics that we measure looking at economic slowdowns and shocks to economies. As previous SOFIs have looked at, and of course as we consider and look at as well when we think about what investments we can make in science and research and development, we know that there's lots of growing resource concerns out there, whether that be growing population, significant urbanization, climate change, and also access to water, both from agricultural production but also to consumers. For example, we know that water stress is likely to continue to increase. We know that roughly 3.6 billion right now, half of the world's population, live in areas that are water scarce for at least 1 month a year, and this is set to rise as the population approaches 10 billion by 2050. By that time, as many as 5 billion people, estimated by UNESCO, could be denied regular supply of water by 2050. And of course, this SOFI digs a little bit more into economic slowdown and economic shocks, as Maximo highlighted in some of his slides. And I just wanted to point out that for those of you that have time and interest, please look there, because there's a lot of, as Maximo said, the SOFI tries to disentangle a lot of these effects, whether using different econometric techniques that are very interesting to look at, and certainly looking for a lot of published research coming out of this SOFI. How can we meet some of those challenges? Well, the Congressman just talked about a lot of things that we can do. Of course, we can invest in stabilizing the macroeconomic conditions here and in other countries, trying to stabilize economic growth, I think, is one of the take-home points from this SOFI. Continued investment in agricultural productivity, we know, is going to yield significant benefits relative to the cost of those investments. And of course, significant reductions in trade barriers is another thing that I'd like to highlight that likely will show up in the SOFI next year, as well as some of the USDA reports that I'll touch on at the end. Of course, this SOFI, as well as our most recent reports, do not capture some of the downturns in economic conditions. This year, for example, we see that the IMF just came out with slower global growth, most of that occurring in emerging and developing countries, translating into as much as $1.7 trillion loss of buying potential for food, and likely to contribute to insecurity going at least for next year's snapshot at looking at what the 2018 as well as the 2019 numbers look like. That reflects weakening financial markets, capital outflows from major emerging markets such as Turkey, Argentina, and Brazil, uncertainty about trade policy, and concerns over China's economy. And it does not this estimate didn't take into account recent Middle East turmoil or more serious trade friction since mid-April. A prime driver of food security is the growth in adequate supplies of agricultural products relative to population growth. We know, of course, that population growth is slowing, but continued increases, at least through 2050, are expected in sub-Saharan Africa, where we have a significant amount of undernourishment and food security is the weakest. So technology, one thing that we look at is, well, what types of technologies can help us continue to produce enough food to outpace that growth in demand, or whether it will outpace that growth in demand. There's a lot of different types of technologies that we don't know will be available over the next 10 to 20 years, but certainly we've been looking at this over time, and I think this is consistently reflected in both FAO's forecasts as well as the OECD. But we see that over time, decline in real food prices is certainly one of the positive aspects of agricultural production over the last 50 years or so. Corn output increasing by more than 435% since 1960, soybeans up by more than 1,000%, rice up by 225, and wheat by 215%. Of course, proteins from meat sources are likely to become more important as well going forward. We also see significant declines in real real meat prices. Here I'm showing livestock, poultry, and milk prices. In U.S. prices, of course, this will differ by which part of the globe we're talking about. And of course, we don't know a lot of what technology will bring us. As I mentioned, my first job with the U.S. government was in Zaire, and this was our technology here on the left-hand side of the screen at that time, pointing out where I was going to be posted. Today, 20 years later, one is able to go on Google Maps and dial in. I can find my village, even though it's not labeled and very difficult to identify even on Google Maps. But certainly I can still pick out where the fish ponds are that I was working on at the time. And so just pointing out that technology over the next 20 years is going to open a lot of possibilities for not only developed but developing countries. We know that one area of increasing productivity comes from utilization of science and technology, and we certainly have seen an increase in biotechnology being utilized by a number of producers, both in the United States as well as some of the countries that we're concerned about going forward. And I just wanted to highlight as well, while we know that we are producing significant amounts of food, getting it to the countries is both important, but also we know that trade does promote improved economic returns as well, knowing that certainly we can see that improvement, generally speaking, in real GDP growth is pushed along by freer trade as well as that's mapped out by real trade growth. And of course, we see some significant downturns here with respect to the Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis in 2008 to 2010. Of course, going forward, again, the more gloomy side of this is that forecast going forward is for relatively stagnant economic and trade growth. Over the past 15 years, we know that global trade in agricultural products has more than doubled, and in some countries by much more than that. Certainly looking at China, it's increased by 10 times over the last 15 years, and we would expect that to continue. One thing that contributes to that is the explosion of regional trade agreements, and here we can see some analysis looking at some regional trade agreements that are monitored by the WTO, growing to more than 290 in force in 2019. Only about, as most recent as 20 years ago, that was only 50 regional trade agreements that were in force at the time. Talking a little bit about consumer preferences, I'll stray a little bit outside my lane, but we do know that certainly the middle class families are likely to increase substantially over the next 10 years. Certainly in China and India, we're expected to see 874 million households reaching the middle class by 2026 and demanding middle class diets at that time. And exports, we've seen that occur in terms of our exports coming out of the United States with a switch over from bulk exports to more consumer-oriented exports such as fruit and vegetables, vegetable oils, processed cereal products, and foods which are easy and quick to prepare. Of course, this, as Maximo points out, doesn't always come with positive results, but certainly it is one that we're seeing as those households move into the middle class. When that occurs is a question mark. Certainly we know that China per capita GDP is about 15 years ahead of India and sub-Saharan Africa. So as those countries move into the middle class and as per capita GDP improves in those countries, we're likely to see an increase in meat consumption. Of course, that will differ by country and by consumer preference. Here we see the growth in China mainland in terms of kilograms per capita consumption of meat and dairy relative to India, and then comparing to Nigeria, showing not much growth yet at all. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit, but just noting that we've been noting the growth in global soybean meal demand over the last 50 years, which translates into a fairly stable, relatively stable increase in meat demand. We've seen beef demand increasing at a relatively stable rate over the last 50 years. I'll just point out that, of course, technology, we look at its ability to improve production, but it does come in lots of different flavors, and we know that consumers feel differently about some of these technologies, whether that be biotech, as represented here by the aqua bounty salmon, or some of the plant or cell technologies for meat alternatives. And certainly we know that technology is improving and bringing down the price of organics as well as fruit and vegetable production. Just want to touch briefly on some USDA estimates of food insecurity globally. Just a caveat, this year, as many of you know, we've seen some significant decreases in our expectations regarding our corn and our soybean crop, mostly due to high levels of precipitation and cold weather in the Midwest. But prior to that, we had been seeing certainly global production exceeding global consumption, and that's what leads into our projections of international food security from the Economic Research Service. I'll just point out our new report's coming out in several weeks. So these are results from last year's report, which are consistent with the SOFI, just showing that per capita income by region, I should say consistent with the SOFI for 2018, the year of 2018. Of course, this projects out 10 years. Just projecting out our expectations about per capita income by region, as well as the price of major grains. As I mentioned earlier, real prices falling, per capita increasing. We do project that we're likely to see a significant decline in food insecurity. This is a slightly different metric compared to the SOFI, but still consistent depending on whether how you're counting calories in terms of diets. But over the next 10 years, expecting to cut food insecurity, so that's a good message, I think, despite the fact that we're not picking up all of the issues that are occurring today. Again, mentioning that the food gap is expected to fall as well, despite the fact that demand is rising. Of course, we all know that that's subject to a lot of uncertainties, whether that be political challenges, weather, energy prices, disease, crop or livestock, and policy changes in importing and exporting countries. So to conclude, 3 quick conclusions. So far, productivity demand is keeping up with productivity is keeping up with demand. Keeping the SDGs in mind, I would be watching trends in that productivity growth relative to the growth in population. And the question mark would be, will prices continue to fall? Conclusion number 2, assuming that prices continue to fall, will income continue to rise? Of course, as Schengen pointed out, the importance of looking at inequality in that metric. And certainly I would echo Maximo's points about putting in place some countercyclical policies to help stabilize economic growth as well. And lastly, I would watch how technology is treated from a regulatory and policy standpoint around the globe, given the challenges I mentioned relative to water, climate, and others, like disease, for example, African swine fever or HPAI in the poultry sector. The potential for biotechnology remains to maintain and increase supplies to meet growing demand is there. The question is will it be used?